Right, so I don't know about you, but there's one big looming question on my mind when it comes to Super Slam, and that is what will the pull rates end up being? Because any way you spin it, this is quite a massive set when it comes to constructed play, right? There is a lot of seemingly important cards. So one Fable 5 Legendaries, that's about on the norm, right? 134 commons, 14 basics, 14 marvels, same on that side, but we get to the middle, 42 Majestics and 40 Super Rares. That is huge. That is essentially maybe 82 impactful cards. Now, we could say that half the super rares are, the top end of rares. That puts rares at 60 themselves, which is about in line what we've seen with previous sets. But that still leaves 20 super rares as sort of the bottom end of Majestics, and they should still be impactful. The ones that have been spoiled, I think, are truly impactful if you're going to build the new heroes from Super Slam. So that, in conjunction with the 31 expansion slot cards and the remaining possible 11 Majestics, which is also somewhat up in the air because we have several key reprints in the expansion slot, so we don't know if they're going to count the legendaries, they're going to count whatever those reprints are, if those reprints are going to be Majestics, or they're going to be, potentially rares that are desirable and needed. So, yeah, it could be, right? 11 Majestics, 31 expansion slot Majestics, and 40 super rares, but who knows? So, overall, what will the rate end up being to make this set as accessible as previous sets? Because I think that is the bar, right? I've talked about this a few different times, that we're continuing this trend of how much product needs to be opened, right, to supply playsets of these important pieces, and it has been steadily increasing, and I would really like to see that curbed come Super Slam. So the expansion slot, we already know, is having a nice change, right? It's being reduced from about 1 in 12.5 booster packs to 1 in 6, but again, factoring in the explosive size, right, of the expansion slot from usually around 14-ish cards to now 31, right, means that that still just evens out. There's not really a substantial amount of change there. It's just accounting for that growth in the card pool. So, first off, why don't we look at the previous set? So we've used this table a few times, right? It's basically looking at the Majestic counts and sets. I've tried to account for the short printings that we're told, so then we can adjust the Majestic count, then we look at the rates, then we can figure out the packs per playset, right? How much product needs to be opened on a community basis to supply playsets. We can see the increase and decrease over the course of time between sets, and then the cases per playset. So again, Welcome to Rathe and Arcane Rising starting at 3.75 cases to again supply a full playset, so 3 of a kind, or 1 of a kind if it has that legendary keyword. I don't think there was anything in Welcome to Rathe or Arcane Rising. I think the first one was Klloo, right, with the Gorganian tone. But yeah, 3.75 cases per playset to now high seas at 5 cases. That is quite a substantial change, right? So again, I don't want to see that number continue to increase. That is something that we've regularly talked about. So basically, in terms of pull rates, right, again, we start off at Welcome to Rathe and Arcane Rising, which did feature super rares, right? So we had Majestics at 1 in 12 packs and super rares at 1 in 6 packs. So overall, collectively, you should pull around 6 of those cards. Now, this doesn't account for Rainbow Falls. We're not told the rate of Rainbow Falls until Heavy Hitters at 1 in 18, but it usually worked out to about 1 or 2 extra cards. So that 6 could be, somewhere between 6 and 8, although sometimes you get a bit unlucky, and maybe it's a 4 to 8, right? But generally speaking, it has stayed around that number throughout sets. So Klloo to Dynasty, we get the conjoined rate where super rares are axed, and basically Majestics just become 1 in 4, but again, that still evens out to that 6 pull rate, right, per box, minus rainbow foils. Then outsiders, we get the worst rate of 1 in 5. Generally speaking, that was probably to account for the fact that they have class combo cards, right? So a Majestic being usable in both Ranger and Assassin, therefore they don't want as many of them in circulation, right? But that aside, we get to Bright Lights, the first set to feature the expansion slot. Now, according to the rate of rares, the expansion slot didn't have any impact on the actual inset Majestics, the limited Majestics. So I'm keeping them at 1 in 4, and the expansion slot Majestics worked out to 1 in 14.3, declared rate being 1 in 15. But then we had the Spring Tunic in there, right? So that probably makes up that little bit of difference. And again, we stick to around 8, right? Now, foils probably pushes that over the edge, but still, nice, steady amount, right? 6 to 8. And then from heavy hitters onwards now high seas, the rate has been for an inset Majestic, a limited Majestic, 1 in 5.9 packs, reverse engineered from the declared rate of rares, and the expansion slot Majestics at 1 in 12.5. So again, still maintaining that pool of 6 of these important play pieces on average in a box, right? Then you chuck on the Rainbow Falls on top. So again, looking somewhere between probably 5 to 8, right, on average. So yeah, First and foremost, that is obviously the rate we want to see maintained with Super Slam. So if we do then account for the expansion slot rate being increased, then we could probably push that to maintaining about 8 on average. So if we were to get 8 of these pieces per box, then essentially the rate for Majestics would be about 1 in 18, and the Super Rares would be 1 in 9. Now, there are various issues with that already. So for one, it's pretty evident that they kind of want Super Rares to be a very impactful piece for the limited. So I would assume that their pull rates should reflect that. But we'll start off at this point, right? So at 1 in 18 for the Majestics, with the count being 11, again, that might be an underestimate, depending on how many of the Majestics are actually expansion slot Majestics. But that means it will take 6 cases to find those playsets of Majestics. For the Super Rares, if it was 1 in 9, again, highly doubt it is 1 in 9, but if it is, then that would be 11 cases. That would be absolutely ridiculous, mainly, again, due to the sheer number of those Super Rares being 40. Then we have the expansion slot Majestics at a count of 31, at that rate of 1 in 6, would be about 6 cases. And that is already also a concern, because that's still an increase from previous sets, right? And all the previous sets that did feature the expansion slot, I basically took whichever was higher, right? If it took more cases to open the expansion slot, we went with that number. If it took more cases to open the limited Majestics, we went with that number. Now, the other rationale for 1 in 18 and 1 in 9 for the Majestics and Super Rares is it is maintaining the 6 to 12 ratio that we had in Arcane Rise and Welcome to Rathe, right? So basically with Majestics now being at 1.59 rather than 1 in 4, that gets us that equivalent rate of Super Rares going to 1 in 9 and Majestics going to 1 in 18 if we were to split them in the same sort of ratio. But again, I would say this is highly unlikely at these rates, right? Now, if we were to return to the first rates of Welcome to Rathe and Arcane Rising, so Majestics being 1 in 12, Super Rares being 1 in 6, it does get a little bit better. The Majestics, again, as long as the count is at that 11, would take about 4 cases, which would be on par, right? Would be a little bit of a retraction. You'd still have that rough time due to the expense slot Majestics, if again, the count is 31. But we still have that problem area of Super Rares, right? Even at 1 in 6, there is just a huge amount of them, right? The volume of Super Rares is significantly greater than Welcome to Rathe or Arcane Rising. So that would put them at 7.5 cases. So now, I think the baseline that I would at least like to see for Super Slam would be it matches the high seas rates, right? So for Majestics, that means they would go up to 1 in 14.5, right? Which is still somewhat awful, but that means it would take 5 cases per playset of our Majestics. For Super Rares, they'd be 1 in 4, which I think is definitely more in line with what I'd expect. Again, they should have some relevancy to limited and draft, right? Again, that would put them at 5 cases. And then the expense slot Majestics still at that 1.6, since that's been declared, would still be at 5.8 or 6 cases, which is still a little bit rough. Although I would highly assume there's going to be equipment, there's going to be other stuff in the expense slot that does shrink that 31 count and therefore rein in the amount of cases it would take to facilitate playsets. Now, on the other side of the coin, we go with the best possible rates, right? The rates that would be kind of attractive to me, but definitely an overestimate. So for the Majestics, they stay at 1.6. Again, that is about what the pull rate is once we separate the limited Majestics from the expansion slot Majestics. That means it would take about 2 cases if the count stays at that 11, right? So again, there's 42 Majestics overall. If we say 31 in the expansion slot, that leaves 11 for limited Majestics. For the Super Rares, 1 and 2, I think would be great to see. Again, that means that every time you draft, you should be seeing at least 1, and therefore that should have that fun, flavorful impact that it seems like they should have for limited. And then, of course, the expense slots, again, still maintaining at that 1.6, but beating out normal Majestics due to the sheer volume of them. Now, I would say these are obviously a gross overestimate, so I think the more realistic expectation I have would be something more aligns with this, right? Majestics at about 1 in 12. That would be about 4 cases to find all the playsets Majestics, which I think is fair. It's a little bit of a retraction from high seas, right? 5 to 4, but it's still up there, right? It still demands a certain level of product sales, right? Then for the Super Rares, 1 in 3. Although, again, I would very much like to see it under 1 in 3. So again, it completely shines in limited. But 1 in 3 means that statistically, it should also always appear when you're drafting, and when you're doing limited, you should get 2 to 3, something like that. And then the expansion slots, I'm actually going to say it's about 1 in 8 because what LSS do like to do is declare compounded rates, right? So basically, the expansion slot is 1 in 6. But the actual expansion slot Majestics might be a little bit harder to pull once we start to take out some of those other cards. So again, I still think that would be fair. That would push the case amount slightly higher. But again, I doubt all 31 expansion slot Majestics are going to be 3 ofs, right? There'll be maybe some legendary specs, definitely some equipment, and then again, we have that reprint factor. Now, we do know that all 40 super rares are signature moves, at least that's the wording being used, but when again comes to the expense slot, we get several key reprints, and reprints don't necessarily have to mean Majestics, or they could be, what we've seen with other Majestics being upped to legendaries. We could see certain rares that, again, are demanded upon being upshifted to Majestics, which I would find a little bit weird, but, nothing's off the table, so to speak. So yeah, overall, I think this is the rate that I would really like to see Super Slam hover around, right? Majestics 1 in 12, if not under that. Supers 1 in 3, right? So at least they have complete relevancy for the limited fun that they should be, showing off. And then the expense slot Majestics being that declared 1 in 6 to maybe at most 1 in 8 when we actually, take out all the other factors involved, right? Those legendaries, those reprints, whatever else might appear in the expansion slot. So then if we were to think about it in a combined sense, right, you'd be pulling a Majestic or a Super Rare every 1.85 packs, which again would hopefully make them really shine when it comes to our limited draft. But for just Majestics overall, it would go up slightly, right? So if the expense slot Majestics were 1 in 6 exactly, right, across the board, then that would mean the rate would stay at that 1 in 4, but at, again, 1 in 8, right? If there's some slight tweaking to it, then that means Majestics overall would slightly go up to 1 in 4.8, right? For reference. For a long time, we've wanted Majestics to be a bit more accessible, so if collectively they are a bit easier to pull, that would be fantastic to see. But other than that, right, hopefully we get some more information with Pro Tour Singapore about to kick off, although I would assume more focus on the Mastery Pack Guardian since it's right around the corner, right? There's still a lot from that, though, we don't know. But yeah, any information about, what might feature in that expansion slot, because the wording of key reprints, there is a lot of cards, and not just Majestics or Legendaries that, might fit that bill. But let me know what you think, right? What would you like to see for Super Slam? Is this the set that we're finally going to get, some decent, hardy change to actually getting our game pieces in a relatively easier manner, right? Overall, hope you enjoyed. See ya.